Before I continue, I want to show you a little something. What you see here is a piece of machine-made paper. It's never been wet. It's only been exposed to normal environmental conditions. Notice the lines in it, the buckling, and the movement in it. That is what I just explained to you, what is occurring. And the edges are not tied down. This will occur with any paper if you give it enough moisture, if you saturate enough and then let it dry. This is what you're going to get. Now let me, and it's thin, very thin, of course. It actually is tracing paper. Now let me show you the same piece of paper, or a piece of paper that's been exposed to the same environmental conditions. This is 140-pound watercolor paper. You can see a little bit of buckling, not very much. You can see a little bit of folding in it. Now that's normal. That's what occurs when it's exposed to humidity. The thicker the paper, though, the less effect you're going to notice. It's always going to happen. It's always going to affect your paper. There is absolutely no way around it. You know, unless you hermetically seal it in some kind of container and then desiccate it, then it probably won't affect it. But most pictures are not. So you know, this is going to occur, and you have to account for it. So you don't want to use really thin stuff and then let it dry out, because it's going to get like that. So you say, okay, I paint in an Oriental style, Sumi-E. I'm not going to stretch my paper. Well, that's fine. But let me tell you, this is the amount of water that you'll use for painting in an Oriental style for the entire painting. This is the amount of water we'll use when we paint in the Western style. We use a lot of water. We use a lot of washes. Now you can see from what I just told you about how your paper reacts and the amount of water that you're going to use. The more water, the more it's going to react. Now you can moderate this a little bit by the thickness of your paper, but not a lot. You have to adjust your technique for the thickness of your paper. If you're going to use thin paper, you're going to have to use this amount of water. The thicker the paper you have, the more water you can use. This. Okay, I'm going to conclude this presentation and answer the question, do you have to stretch paper? The answer is not necessarily. It depends on your technique and the materials that you're using. Now here are cases where you don't stretch. Obviously you can't stretch. We used something that is not paper, multimedia board. It's synthetic. I don't care for it, but some people use it. You know, it's good for acrylics. It's not good for watercolor. You can use watercolor canvas. That's nice. It's a clay and it absorbs very quickly. Aqua board's much the same, except it's on a board. Now, if you really don't want to put up with all the buckling and cockling and stretching and all that, you can use a Bristol board, basically. This is a crescent board. It's made specifically for watercolors. It has sort of a smooth surface. It's nice, but you know, it's smooth, and you have to deal with the smoothness of it. Now, one way to make sure that your watercolor paper never ever buckles is to glue it down. You go get a piece of hardboard like this. Get you some acrylic-based medium. Don't use Elmer's glue or any water-based stuff. You'll have a mess. Get yourself a brayer, a roller. Spread all that acrylic stuff on here. Take your paper and glue it down. It's not going to move. Guaranteed it's not going to move. Only one drawback to it. You mess up your paper, you mess up your painting, Well, you're going to have to throw this away and your painting away, or you can turn it over and use the back side. That's the only alternatives. That can get expensive if you're not careful. Now, what I typically use. I use watercolor blocks for small paintings, and let me show you what that is. This is a small watercolor block, all right? It's glued on 4 edges. The papers, you can buy it cold pressed. You can buy 140 pound and 300 pound. The 300 pound is really nice. It doesn't buckle as much when you put water on. Now look, this is still going to buckle. When I put water here, it's going to raise up from what I told you earlier. The only thing that's stopping it from messing up the whole paper is these edges here. They're all glued down. You know, and that makes it really nice to work with. So if I'm doing paintings less than a half sheet of watercolor paper, typically I'll use a watercolor block. Now there is a problem with the blocks. When you get large blocks, like this one here, and this is about as large as you can get, and you put water on there and you put a lot of washes on it, it starts putting a lot of force on these edges here. And you can see what happened here with mine. They start coming apart. I mean, we're talking about a lot of force being exerted on this paper. And you can see it's starting to come apart. So when you get big, you're going to really have to consider stretching your watercolor paper and tying it down so that you can use the technique that you want to use. Now, if you're not using a lot of water and you do a lot of dry brushing or minimal strokes, you really probably don't need to stretch it if you use thick enough paper. Use 300 pound paper. If you use 500 pound paper, you probably can get away with never stretching that paper. I mean, that's pretty thick paper, and you got to put a lot of water on it for it to penetrate deep enough so it really causes buckling that sets in. Okay. That's it. Now this lesson is divided into 2 parts. This is the first part. Since it's very technically demanding to stretch paper, I'm going to reserve that for its own session itself. It requires practice, and any time you're using a full sheet of paper that's less than about 500 pounds and your technique is such as that you need to use a lot of water, you're going to have to stretch. I stretch when I use an airbrush, and when I use, and I can tell you now, I don't care how thick your paper is, if you pull out the airbrush and you start using it, you better have it tied down, or else it's going to start buckling on you. Meaning, when I say tied down, I mean stretched.